for this evening. This is the third of the pivotal moments in Australian radical history. The type of history you won't read in the history books or see anywhere else. Now, with Anzac Day coming up, I felt an appropriate subject I've done some research on over the years is the World War I and the anti-conscription movement. Now, look, I have no problems with Anzac Day being a day of remembrance for the dead. But I do have a big problem with the way Anzac Day has been used to condition, and is being used to condition us to accept militarisation and the fact that war will happen. And over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen more and more Australians move into this thing. And the thing is about history is that everything has happened before. Nothing is new. And if we don't look at all our history, we do a disservice to us, our community, our friends, our relatives, our workmates, and our nation. So tonight I'm going to concentrate on World War I and something that was quite extraordinary that happened during World War I, which is hardly ever spoken about. World War I started on the 1st of August 1914. And if you were in one of the major capital cities in this country, you would think it was a great festival. Almost 95% of the population of Australia were looking forward to the war, which was going to be over in 4 to 6 weeks. They were going to teach the Huns a lesson. And if you look at pictures of that period, those first week in August, you will see crowds of people fighting, young Australian men fighting each other in order to enlist. Now, a lot of people think World War I, if you listen to the propaganda, was a war about freedom and democracy. World War I was nothing more than a struggle between workers at either end of a bayonet fighting for the glory of God, King and country. And if you look at any of the material, it says that. They were fighting for they were fighting for the Mother England, they were fighting for the King, they were fighting for God, they were fighting for country. I mean, World War I, where over 25 million people died, was nothing more than a dirty little European trade war, basically. And all the royal families that were heads of governments, like Tsar in Russia, and the so-called democracies, were all interlinked by a series of messages. Marriages. The great thing about Queen Victoria and her productivity as a mother is she had a lot of daughters which she married off. Like one daughter to the Tsar, one daughter to some German royalty, and it went on and on. So, World War I, great support for World War I in Australia. People were falling over themselves to volunteer. It was a great adventure. Remember, people didn't travel in those days. People were basically involved in humdrum work, most of it agricultural, some in the cities, in factories, some in the mines. Life was hard, and the idea of a war and the jingoism and the bands playing kind of excited people. People got really excited. Out of a population of 5,420,000 Australian boys and men, and I'll talk about, I'll use the word boys and men, volunteered to fight in this war for the glory of God, King and country. If you extrapolate the fact that we've got 5 times that population, that would be equivalent to 2 million Australian boys and men volunteering today to fight the Chinese or the Russians, wherever the enemy is these days. Of those 420,000 went overseas, 62,000 died on the Middle Eastern and European killing fields. 8,000 Australians died in one day in the Battle of the Somme in France in 1916. If you extrapolate those figures and you add a 5 to it, that's over 310,000 dead. And of those that came back, another 60,000 died of war wounds within 10 years of coming back. So you're looking at a casualty rate of 600,000 in today's figures. Extraordinary numbers. So obviously, people, and most of the people that died, well, all of them, were buried overseas. So the nation went through a period of mourning, and most of the Anzac memorials you see today and the avenues of honour were not erected after World War II or the Vietnam War, or the Korean War, or the Malaysian emergency, or Afghanistan. They were erected during World War I, because this was a reminder to people of those men and boys that had perished in this war. So let's look at the history. In 1916, the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Billy Hughes, who Mr. Keating describes as he described Morrison as the worst Prime Minister since Billy Hughes, and you'll understand why Billy Hughes was such a terrible Prime Minister when I finish. He described the industrial workers of the world as people who preach sabotage, people who practice sabotage, people who are anti-conscriptionists to a man, people who are anarchists and enemies of society. That was the description. So who were the IWW? Who were the industrial workers of the world? Why were they such a figure of hatred in 1916? Well, in 1903, in Colorado in the USA, there was a coal miners' strike which failed. And out of that grew a militant industrial unionism under the leadership of a bloke called Big Bill Haywood. And on the 27th of June 1905, the militant industrialists, the militant workers, made a coalition with the Socialist Labor Party. That was in 1905. Within 2 to 3 years, that association broke down because the industrial workers of the world were a militant workplace organisation which organised on the basis of workplace. Here in Australia, we tend to have a structured representation as far as the workforce is concerned based on trade. The industrial workers of the world in many of the European unions are based on one common union within one common workplace. When the IWW broke into two factions, there was what's called the De Leon faction, which was named after the secretary of the Socialist Labor Party, and there was the Industrial Workers of the World, or the Chicago faction, which moved to Chicago. And in 1911, a handful of socialists in Adelaide asked the Chicago IWW for a charter so they could form an Industrial Workers of the World organisation in Australia. By May 1912, the next year, a chapter had been formed in Sydney, which had a membership almost as big as this audience, 12 people. That was its membership. So how did this minuscule, irrelevant organisation with 12 members in Sydney and about 4 or 5 members in Adelaide become this revolutionary, radical force in Australia during World War I? Well, what happened is, when the war was declared, Andrew Fisher, who was the Labor Prime Minister, and this was his third term as Prime Minister, declared that Australia supported the war effort to the last man and the last shilling. the last man and the last shilling. They supported the war effort. What happened is, and this is where the Murdochs can be rehabilitated, is that, I know it's hard after their defamation loss today, but what happened is that Murdoch, Rupert's grandfather, was sent to the Dardanelles to cover the Anzac campaign on behalf of Fisher, the Prime Minister, who didn't believe a lot of the propaganda that was going on. And when Fisher realised how horrible things were and how many men were dying needlessly in the Dardanelles campaign and the incompetence of the British leadership, he had a nervous breakdown, which you won't read about in the history books. But what happened is, it was glossed over, it was said that he didn't attend Parliament on 3 consecutive days without an excuse. In other words, he had a breakdown. He couldn't really stomach what had happened. In steps Billy Hughes, who was unanimously elected by the Labor Party to be the Prime Minister of Australia. In the interim, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Sydney branch, became bigger and more militant, pushing an anti-war and an anti-conscription program. Now, there's a bloke called Tom Barker who actually only died in the 60s after becoming mayor of some town in England I've forgotten. But he was a young man born in 1886 in the Lakes Districts in England. At 15 left home, at 17 joined the 8th Hussars, an Irish regiment. He was delisted a few years later because he had rheumatic fever. He turns up in New Zealand in 1912. He was a great speaker, good writer. He joined the Industrial Workers of the World, which had been set up in New Zealand in 1912, and then he was an organiser for a 2-year strike, which I'm sure Doug will remember, almost remember, 1912 and 1913, which paralysed New Zealand. He was charged with sedition, put on bail. What did he do? Jumped bail and went to Sydney. Joined the Industrial Workers of the World in Sydney, that minuscule group of 12 people. I think we've got more than 12 here now. That minuscule group. And he put his energy into the anti-conscription struggle. And in 1915, one of the greatest, most important anti-war posters began to appear on the walls of Sydney. It was a very simple poster which actually encapsulated what was happening. It said, "To arms, to arms." And then it said, "Capitalists, politicians, parsons," we call them priests these days, parsons, landlords, newspaper editors, and other stay-at-home patriots. Workers, follow your masters. So he was charged under the War Precautions Act, and this is important, the New South Wales War Precautions Act, for prejudicing recruitment, right? He was tried in September 1915, found guilty, fined £50, which is a heavy amount in those days, with 6 months imprisonment. He appealed and won on a technicality, and the technicality was the fact that he was charged under the War Precautions Act in New South Wales, not the Commonwealth Act. The charge was dismissed. Emboldened by this direct action, which he was the editor of and also the secretary of the IWW in Sydney, emboldened by this action, continued their campaign, their anti-war campaign and their anti-conscription campaign, because the Universal Conscription League wanted every able-bodied Australian male to volunteer. This is the period when you get a white feather in your letterbox or your lunchbox because you are a coward and you're supposed to join up. This was that period. And the government did a survey in late 1915 and found there were 600,000 bludgers who hadn't volunteered to die for God, King and country. 600,000. Now, when Billy Hughes became Prime Minister, there was a huge division in the workers' movement, especially the union movement, about the question of conscription. And the majority of the union movement was against conscription. So Billy Hughes had a problem. He went to England in January 1916, during the height of the war, stayed there for 6 months, enjoying being Duchessed. I don't know, does anybody know what the word Duchess means? It's a good old term when a working class boy makes good, goes to England and he's showered with gifts and lovely things, you know. He was Duchess there, and he was convinced that he had to introduce conscription in Australia. During that period, when he was away, the National Congress of Trade Unions in I think it was June 1916, narrowly passed, a bill to introduce conscription was narrowly defeated. Now, it was defeated almost unanimously by the National Union of Trade Unions, but the next motion was that they have a general strike against conscription, and that was narrowly defeated. So when Billy Hughes came back from England after being Duchess for 6 months during the height of the war, when tens of thousands of people were being slaughtered and thousands of Australians were being slaughtered in the most unimaginable ways, he said, we need to introduce conscription because there's 600,000 other able-bodied men. That means 1 million. He wanted to send 1 million people to the killing fields. So he went to the Labor Party caucus and he wanted to introduce conscription. The Labor Party caucus refused to introduce conscription. And what he did then, when they refused, he had a motion put up to hold a plebiscite. Not a referendum, but a plebiscite. There's a big difference between a referendum and a plebiscite. You know, people talk about the voice. A referendum means that the people in this country make a choice to include something in the Constitution. If it's in the Constitution, it cannot be altered by Parliament. A plebiscite is basically a counting exercise to see who's for and against. A government does not have to take any notice of a plebiscite. As we saw with the marriage equality laws, that was a plebiscite. It wasn't incorporated in the Constitution. It was just it was just to see who was against and who was for. So a plebiscite was introduced, right? At the same time, Direct Action, the weekly newspaper now of the industrial workers of the world, which was selling thousands of copies on the streets of Sydney, found a very good cartoonist called Sid Nichols. Now, Sid Nichols is the same man who later on invented the cartoon character Ginger Meggs, which all us older Australians would remember, good old Ginger Meggs. Now, but Sid Nichols was a bit of a radical, and he got this brilliant cartoon because in 1914, 1915, the government was trying to raise money for the war. And what they had is a prospectus to raise £10 million, and the advertising surrounding the prospectus was just incredible. It said, no sacrifice required. No sacrifice required. Higher returns than normal. Be patriotic, but no sacrifice. Well, people are sacrificing their lives in the European killing fields. No sacrifice. Invest and you'll get a higher return.
Is that war bonds?
War bonds, yeah, £10 million. So Sid Nichols, and I've got, for those of you who will remain at the end, you have these pictures, did this extraordinary cartoon. Remember, this is the height of the war. He nailed a soldier to a cross on an upturned cannon, right? Daggers through his hands, daggers through his feet, dripping blood. At the bottom of the cross is this, investor. holding up a skull with the top cut off, and blood is dripping into the skull. And the investor is saying, "Long live the war, hip hip hooray, fill them up again." And this was a war this was a poster which highlighted the war profiteering that was going on, the fact that the ruling classes were not sending their kiddies to the war, the fact that it was ordinary people who were being sacrificed, the fact that wages were pegged, the fact that prices were going up. And obviously Tom Barker, being the editor of Direct Action, once again finds himself in court. This time there is no way he can get out of because he was prosecuted under the Right Act, and he was fined £100. He refused to pay the fine and was jailed for 12 months. Now, we go back to 1916. The plebiscite legislation is passed, but it was actually called the Conscription Referendum Act, believe it or not, although it was a plebiscite. The Conscription Referendum Act, it was passed. And the propaganda began. Huge propaganda on both sides, both the conscriptionist and the anti-conscriptionist. By now, this little industrial workers of the world rump and a few socialist hangers-on had become into a large movement, because what happened is 3/4 of the trade union movement was against conscription. Archbishop Mannix, who was a Roman... we all do, like I said, Robert's father did some good things. Archbishop Mannix, who was disgusted by what happened at the Easter Revolt in Dublin, where the leaders were executed by the British authorities, took up the anti-conscription struggle in the Roman Catholic Church, which was dominated by Catholics at that particular point in time. At the same time, the women's movement got a new lease of movement. A new lease of life. Valda Goldstein organised the Women's Peace Army, which was actually located at Story Hall at RMIT in Melbourne. And their slogan was, "We war against war." So we had women coming into the anti-conscription movement, the trade unionists coming into the anti-conscription movement, and the Irish Catholics coming into the anti-conscription movement, and the descendants of the German immigrants that have come to South Australia coming into the anti-conscription movement. Now you've got to remember that this campaign became really vicious. You could be jailed for singing an anti-war song, and people were jailed for singing anti-war songs at public meetings. And what eventually happened was that on the 3rd of October, remember the date, 1916, 12 members of the IWW were charged with sedition, treason, conspiracy to commit arson. Now, when you think about this, guess what was happening on the 28th of October? The plebiscite for conscription. At the same time, 3 members of the Tottenham branch of the Industrial Workers of the World were charged with murder for murdering Constable Duncan in Tottenham. And their trial was held on the 10th of October, 8 days before the plebiscite. So you can imagine...
Is that Tottenham in England or Tottenham down here?
Here, Tottenham down here. Not here, it's Sydney, outside Sydney, Tottenham.
Oh, that's not Sydney.
Yeah, Tottenham. There was Roland and Herbert Kennedy and Frank Franz. Now the extraordinary thing is the 3 were charged with the murder. The constable was shot in the police station. There were 2 separate trials. One for Roland, who was 20 years old, one for Frank, and one for Herbert. And Herbert and Frank were found guilty of murder, and they were executed 4 weeks later, hung at Goulburn jail. But their brother Herbert, who was there with them, was found not guilty, and he was released. So who knows whether they shot the constable or not. But they were hung 4 weeks later, just after the plebiscite. Now, at the same time this is happening, On the 4th of October, here in Melbourne, we had the biggest demonstration in terms of percentage of population that has ever been seen. And it was a women's demonstration where the only speakers at the Yarra Bank who spoke against conscription were women from the Women's Peace Army. And over 100,000 Victorians congregated. They marched from Story Hall down to the Yarra Bank to hear this bevy of women speakers. That was on the 4th of October. The day before the plebiscite, on the 28th of October 1916, the headlines in all the papers, which obviously they supported the war and conscription, was the Kaiser, and the IWW want you to vote no. The Anzacs want you to vote yes. The problem was the Anzacs, who were drifting back from the Middle East and the European killing fields, became involved in the anti-conscription struggle because they didn't want their fellow Australians to be slaughtered in that way. But these were the headlines. So you can imagine 3 members of the IWW charged with murder, 2 found guilty of murder and sentenced to hung 10 days before the plebiscite. 12 members of the Sydney branch of the IWW charged with treason, sedition, arson, conspiracy to commit arson, put on trial on the 3rd of October. So you can imagine the hysteria, and obviously Billy Hughes felt the referendum would pass, or the plebiscite would pass. Guess what? The plebiscite was held, and the No campaign, and this is the extraordinary victory which won't be celebrated around this country. You don't see monuments to it. The No campaign had a majority of 72,467. Now, Billy Hughes was a smart politician. He had just been expelled from the Labor Party after the plebiscite because he continued to promote conscription. The Premier of New South Wales, Mr. Holman, who was an ex-socialist and ALP member, was also expelled. So Billy Hughes walked into the ALP caucus knowing that he would be expelled from the Labor Party. So what did he do? There were 65 members of the caucus. He collected 22 of them, plus him, which makes 23. They crossed the floor of Parliament and joined the opposition. And he continued to remain Prime Minister. So they joined the Nationalists. And a few months later, the Liberals joined the coalition, and they called themselves the National Labor Party. Okay? So you think, oh, well, this is the end of it. It's all finished. No, it's not. It gets better. It gets even better. Now, because of the hysteria and the fact that this coalition of these conservative groups, pro-conscriptionist groups, had come together, what occurred is there was a series of strikes in Australia, especially down the eastern seaboard. Coal miners, wharf workers, the usual suspects, coal miners, wharf workers, who else? Broken Hill miners, the usual rabble, they all joined together. During the height of the war. Not just against anti-conscription, but against war profiteering, against escalating prices, against pegged wages. And obviously people got a little bit nervous. Now Holman, the Premier of New South Wales, called a snap election. And guess what? He won handsomely. So what did our friend Billy Hughes do now that he was the Prime Minister and the leader of the Nationalists, which included the Liberals, the old Nationalists and the ALP rump he called an election. And guess what? He won a majority in both houses of Parliament. Wonderful. So what this allowed him then to wreak his revenge on the industrial workers of the world. And this is where the parallels come in. The organisation was banned. Its newspaper had to cease publication. Members were jailed for 6 months. Its assets were seized. The organisation was basically destroyed. Now, if you think of the hysteria regarding the anti-terrorist legislation here 20 years ago when that young doctor got inadvertently called up and jailed, you'll see that a lot of the legislation which was passed 20 years ago is very similar to the legislation which was passed in 1917. The Attorney General today in this country can ban any organisation he likes, including this little group, because he feels we may prejudice Commonwealth interests. We may prejudice Commonwealth interests. And if anybody belongs to a member of a banned continues to belong to a member of a banned organisation, unlike Billy Hughes, we're only jailed for 6 months, you can be jailed for up to 25 years. The thing about legislation, it may not have been used, but it is there in place. And it was again from that hysteria. But getting back to World War I. So, what does Billy Hughes do? Because he wants conscription, because his friends in Britain are calling for men to be sacrificed in the Middle East and the European killing fields. He needs to keep his, integrity with his British masters. This isn't a former Labor Prime Minister. So what does he do? He calls a new plebiscite. There's no resistance, there's no radical resistance from the industrial workers of the world. They have been destroyed. Those of you who in radical circles will know Monty Miller. Monty Miller was the #1 radical in Australia for decades. As a 15-year-old boy, he was involved in the Eureka Rebellion. In 1916, at the age of 86, 1917, at the age of 86, he was jailed for 6 months with hard labour at 86 for seditious conspiracy for prejudicing recruitment. So there were all these prisoners. So what happened to the IWW-12? Well, they were tried in late 1916. They were tried with treason, sedition, conspiracy to commit arson, and they were convicted of a conspiracy to commit arson. 5, and hopefully I get this right, 5, Baker, Grant, Fagan, Hamilton and Team were jailed for 15 years, political prisoners. Besant, Glynn, Moore, McPherson, Reeve and Larkin were jailed for 10 years, and King was jailed for 5 years for conspiracy to commit arson. But we'll talk about this later on, what happened after the war. So Billy Hughes calls us another referendum. Another plebiscite. He is convinced they'll be able to introduce conscription, although the body count is rising. Could you imagine you get a knock on the door from the local police officer and say, look, I'm sorry, Miss or Mrs. Jones, your 18-year-old son has died. We don't know where his body is, but we think he's dead. He's missing in action. So when you've got 62,000 young men dying during a 4-year period in a population of 5 million, that is a significant number. So people were having second thoughts about the war and what it was really about and who was profiteering and who was making the sacrifices. So the second plebiscite was held. This is the interesting thing. It was called on the 17th of November 1917. Does anybody know what this 17th of November 1917 was?
It's the Greek resistance group that got shot in Hill. 17th November that fought against
Yeah, but where did they get that from? That's right, the Bolsheviks seized power on the 17th. So the day the Bolsheviks seized power, he called for a plebiscite in December 1917. And then he went on a whistle-stop tour. And this is where he gets funny. Although a lot of dead people, it's still funny. He ends up in Warwick in Queensland, where a disgruntled punter throws an egg at him, which breaks on his coat. And he demands, his entourage demands that Senior Sergeant Kenny arrest the miscreant who threw the egg. And Senior Sergeant Kenny says, excuse me, I'm a state police officer. I don't answer to the Commonwealth of Australia. I only answer to Red Ted Ryan, He was the radical Labor Premier of Victoria at that time, who was an anti-conscriptionist. So Hughes complained to Red Ted Ryan, and Red Ted Ryan telling me, says, Senior Constable, you know, he's right. The Senior Sergeant Kenny is right. He answers to me, not to you. Piss off. So in a huff, because he's got a majority in both Houses of Parliament, he races back to Canberra. Legislation is passed to create the Commonwealth Police. And if you look at cartoons at that political cartoons at that particular point in time, you've got this Bobby with a little hat and a baton hatching out of this egg. So I did suggest to the federal police about 2 decades ago that they actually adopt that as their insignia, because that was the birth. A rotten egg was the birth of the federal police. I didn't get far, obviously.
Warwick, Queensland?
Warwick, Queensland. Nothing happens in this anywhere else, you know that. Yeah. Warwick, I said he went to Warwick. I didn't say where. So Warwick, he's nitpicky, you know. He's a truck driver. They're like that. So that was Warwick. So the votes are counted. Guess what? The majority against conscription increases to 166,588. Now, Billy Hughes, smart man, had said that he would resign as Prime Minister if the plebiscite failed. So what did he do? He went up to the Governor-General, he resigned, and then he asked the Governor-General to reappoint him as Prime Minister. And he was reappointed as Prime Minister the same day. Yeah, that's Billy. He was a great Australian, Billy. Great Australian.
Where's he buried?
I don't know. I don't know. But he's a great Australian. Paul Keating will tell you that. He's the scourge of the Labor Party, Billy was. So, what happened? The war was drawing to an end. Holman lost the election in New South Wales, and a Labor Party government was formed. There was a lot of agitation about the IWW-12. We were spending 15 years, 10 years in jail for conspiracy to commit arson. A Royal Commission was called, the Street Royal Commission, by Royal Commissioner Street. And he found some very nasty things. But the government of the day was not willing to release the findings of the Royal Commission, because it's up to the government of the day to release the findings. You don't have to release them. So there was more pressure, so a second Royal Commission was called, and this time they appointed a Supreme Court judge from Tasmania to the New South Wales Royal Commission. And he found that as far as the IWW-12 was concerned, police perjury. He also found that witnesses were forced to perjure themselves or they would be charged with conspiracy. He also found that the arson which occurred in Sydney at that particular point in time was most likely lit by the New South Wales Anti-Subversion Police Unit. And as this is going on, members of the IWW have been slowly released from jail. In August 1920, 10 of them were released. 2, Larkin was a bit of a character. He was released in August 1921. And poor old King, who was sentenced to 5 years, did his 5 years and was released. He was the last one released in November 1921. So their lives were ruined. It was a conspiracy which went not just the local police force, not just the New South Wales government, but all the way to the federal government in order to create the hysteria necessary to pass the anti-conscription bill. So what's important about this period of history? I know it can be funny. This is very serious. As I said, if you look at today's figures, you would have had, at a population of 5,420,000 volunteered. In today's figures, that's 2 million. Could you imagine 2 million Australians volunteering to fight against the Chinese? Of those that volunteered, 62,000 died. Today's figures, multiply it by 5, that's 310,000. Could you imagine us accepting a mortality rate of 310,000? These were extraordinary numbers. It had an extraordinary effect on Australian history. It changed the course of Australian history. It radicalised the nation. Not just those that are against conscription, but many of the veterans who fought, Australian veterans who fought in World War I. Now, I think it was 1922, 1923, and there was a police riot down at Port Melbourne against the wharfies. And one of the wharfies was killed, and his name, I think, was Whittaker. There's a little monument to him there. And he was a veteran of World War I. So it changed the trajectory of the nation. But the important thing is today, in 2023, it's the same hysteria, the same rhetoric, the same push to militarise the country, the same push to slowly to condition us to think that war has to happen and we need to be part of that war effort. And if there's one thing that World War I teaches us, that even in the midst of war, that we as a people are capable of doing things to actually blunt the amount of pain and suffering that people have to go through. And the dilemma in the difference between 1914 to 1918 and 2023 is the diversions that we have today. There are so many diversions. I mean, people used to volunteer to go to war so they'd get an overseas trip. That's how bad things were, how boring things were. But today there are just so many diversions and such lack of interest in the population about how we're slowly being conditioned. So I'd like to thank you for coming. I've got a little booklet you can have. If you find that I've fibbed about some of the figures, you can come up to me and I will debate it with you. But most of the figures are correct. I think it's an extraordinary piece of Australian history. The only place you will see a monument to the plebiscite is inside Trades Hall, Melbourne Trades Hall, on the side entrance of Lygon Street. And those of you that are going to join me for the anarchist walking tour on the 1st of May, that's Monday the 1st of May, starting at 11 a.m. at Chummy Place, we'll be going there to have a look at that particular monument where it's etched there. And it was inside Trades Hall because it was going to be vandalised if it was outside Trades Hall.
Now, John,
Yes. Sorry, Carolyn.
apparently our Prime Minister's hero was Billy Hughes.
You're kidding.
You know that?
No, I can't believe that. No, come on.
That's what I've been...
Is that why him and Keating are at loggerheads? Because Keating called him the worst Australian Prime Minister in history.
He knew his stuff, didn't
Well, he knew his history. That's why he promoted the Kokoda against Anzac, because he understood that Anzac was just a heap of lies. The World War was just a heap of lies. Not about democracy or freedom or protecting the country. It was about God, King and country. And you had people being sacrificed, workers on either end of a bayonet. You know, 600,000 died on the Austrian-Italian border. 8,000 died in one day, Australians, in the Battle of the Somme. 25. See, in those days, men fought men. It's not like today where 90%, as we see in Sudan today, are civilians, casualties. You know, most of the casualties that occurred were soldiers. And if those of you have been to Europe, I do recommend you go to some of these war cemeteries and you'll be astounded by the kilometres of crosses. And if you've got time, you walk over and you look at them. 18, 19, 20, 22, you know, for nothing. Sorry.
I want to ask, except IWW, which of course, there was the only, radical organization at the time.
Yes. Well, there was the Socialist Party. There were a number of socialist parties which actually assisted the IWW.
Victorian Socialist Party, you mean? VSP was around by the time, 16,
I think they were, as you know, the IWW broke into two factions: the militant Chicago faction, the De Leon. I think the Victorian Socialist Party was part of the De Leon faction.
Which was one, of the components, future
Yeah.
Party of Australia.
Yeah, they didn't come in function until 1921 when they were formed, the Communist Party of Australia. But the Victorian Socialist Party, there were a few.
There was not, another radical organisation at the time.
There were other radical organisations.
IWW.
Yeah, they were the main ones that promoted the anti-conscription movement. Because even in the Socialist Party, there's divisions. As you saw, even amongst the anarchists in Europe, there was divisions.
Yeah, I know.
You know, so yes,
I'm really curious about how they lost the plebiscite twice.
yes.
When there was so much propaganda from the newspapers, from the government. What happened that
The body count rose.
the body?
It's all about the body count, because people they didn't think of war on an industrial scale. They were thinking of war in a 19th century kind of, esoteric, wonderful type of heroic battle. They didn't think of death. The thing which changed people's opinion was the body count. Starting at the Dardanelles on the Anzac Cove, 8,000 died there. That's an extraordinary number. We had 26 die in Afghanistan. We thought it was the end of the universe. 510 in Vietnam. I think 12 in the Malaysian emergency, and about 500 in Korean War. And it was only about 20,000 Australians died. I think about 22,000 during World War II. So you could imagine you're sitting on your farm, no phones, no SMS, no internet. You've sent your 18-year-old lad, he's volunteered, he wants to see Egypt and see the world and be a man. And then you get a knock on the door, not even a telegram in those days. A knock on the door from the local police officer telling you that your son's dead. You don't have a body to grieve over. You can't, he's just disappeared. That's why they built all the war memorials, to remember them, and the honours, the avenues of honour, which should have a plaque next to each tree, which has disappeared in most of those avenues of honour today. The one at Bacchus Marsh, they still got some. Yeah, they've all gone. Yeah. Yeah, so it was the body count. Reality.
So was the plebiscite carried in every state?
No, there were some states, and I think Victoria, to our chagrin, was one where people voted yes.
That's right, yeah.
But if a plebiscite, it doesn't matter. With the referendum we're going to have, it's 4 states and an absolute majority. For a plebiscite, it's just a
With the
popularity poll.
Victoria, I mean,
Yeah.
Dr. Mannix, or when I was a kid, he always called Dr. F. Mannix. My
Yeah.
father hated him intensely. But it used to be the story that he was purely Irish-centric. That
That's right.
He basically didn't want Catholics dying.
That's right.
And so he didn't really, wasn't concerned for the Australian public. The
That's right,
ordinary
that's
Australians.
right.
It was only the Irish
Yeah.
and the Catholics who he was concerned for, nothing else. That was levelled at him. That generally wasn't true, but I think in Victoria that may have swayed people.
Yeah.
Because he was very much a Melbourne figure. I've been reading Power Without Glory, and John Hardy refers to that association between Mannix, say, and John Red, who was purely or pushing the conscription, putting money into the conscription cause.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was quite interesting.
Well, he was horrified by what happened with the Easter Rebellion in Dublin. People weren't horrified that people were killed in the battle, but they were horrified of how the leadership was executed. And Archbishop Mannix, being a traditional Catholic, Roman Catholic, used for whatever reason. I mean, everybody had different reasons for voting no. I mean, women had the reason because they didn't want their sons to be sacrificed. The Catholics, the Irish Catholics, were thinking about what happened at the Easter Rebellion in April 1916. The German migrants who made their home in South Australia were thinking about their relatives, on the other side. So there's different reasons. It'll be like this referendum we're going to have. There'll be different reasons for people voting in different ways. But it was the body count. That was the key. That's what changed people's opinion.
So, Joe, the other day I was driving up Canterbury Road towards St Kilda, and you come to the junction of Canterbury Road, Fitzroy Street, Grey Street, where that Labor Member of Parliament, Federal Parliament, was his name, had his office there on the corner. There's a big billboard flashing out as you drive up, the Anzac Spirit.
That's right.
The Anzac Spirit.
Yeah.
And
It's
the
wrong.
billboard's about as wide as this room.
Yeah.
You can see it a kilometre coming up towards. Now, what's the Anzac Spirit?
Well, the Anzac Spirit to me is suicide, because people were ordered to go out of their trenches to face machine guns to win a metre of soil. Hundreds, thousands. There's no spirit in that. The Anzac Spirit, if you look at the whole thing, to me is what happened in New Guinea in World War II, where, have you ever heard of the chocolate soldiers? Yeah, melt in the sun. Well, what happened in World War II, most of our troops were in the Middle East. And Curtin, was it Curtin? He's the Prime Minister then? Yeah, I think it was Curtin. And the Japanese Imperial Forces took Singapore. They'd gone through Malaysia, took Singapore, they're island hopping, they get to New Guinea. Curtin demands that the Australian troops, which are stationed in the Middle East, come back to Australia to defend Australia. Because this is the first time that Australia, this is, post-colonisation, the first time that Australia is under threat from an enemy, because they bombed Darwin, where they killed 324 people in one bombing raid. They bombed Broome. They bombed Katherine. They bombed Alice Springs.
Alice Springs.
Yes, the Brisbane line was set up, and that means the government decided to only defend things south of Brisbane, because they just couldn't defend it. The Torres Strait Islanders were relocated because they thought maybe they'd be sympathetic to the Japanese, although the Torres Strait Islander Battalion was an important battalion in World War II. So what happened is, all these young conscripts, these 18, 19, 20-year-olds, who the old boys in the Middle East called chocolate soldiers because they'll melt in the sun, with 2 months training, were sent to defend Australia in New Guinea. And they put up a hell of a struggle in the Kokoda Trail, Mill Bay, Kokoda Trail, and they turned back for the first time the Japanese Imperial Forces advance. Now, when
The Japanese didn't have a word for surrender or turn around.
well, and they did. They did turn around.
Turn around and keep walking.
Yeah, that's right. But the thing is, what I'm saying is, Keating, for all his, shortcomings, he made the point. The Anzac Spirit is about Kokoda. It's about the defence of the country. It's not about dying fighting other people's wars. That's what the Anzac, to me, that's what the Anzac Spirit is. It's those chocolate soldiers who didn't melt, who did the job and protected the country from being overrun. I was listening to an interview, this is very funny, with an elderly Japanese pilot in his 90s, and he said he did a ring round Melbourne. He was sent from a battleship, and he did a ring round Melbourne, and he looked at all Melbourne, and nobody actually noticed that he was a little plane. Yeah. And if you go to Gippsland, there are stories about mines which were laid and which sank ships down on the coast of Victoria during World War II. So to me, there is an Anzac Spirit, but that spirit is not about fighting other people's wars in other people's countries. It's about defending this country from invasion. To me, that's what is the Anzac Spirit, not what happened in World War I. But the thing is, you've got to be careful how things are packaged, because it's all about how you look at things. And this idea that the beginning of Anzac, that World War I was about liberty and freedom and all this, it's just a total 100% lie. But it's very difficult. So what I say to people is, I have no problem with Anzac Day. I have no problem with people remembering the dead, even if they fought in wars that I think were useless, a waste of life. But you need to remember those people, and the families should be given that space to remember those. But for a government or an opposition or a media to use that day to promote militarism and condition us to the idea of war, to me, that is the ultimate betrayal of us as a people.
See, this year they've got a particular problem because there's an Australian soldier now He's been released from jail because he was going to be affected by terrorists if they put him in proper jail. But he's been charged with murder of a civilian in Afghanistan. Now, when I saw that, it's about a month ago, it was on the late news. I think it was a Thursday night, it was on 11 o'clock news. I thought the next morning this will be all over the newspapers, be all over the electronic media. Not a mention. There was only page 3, I think, of the Herald Sun, and the second page of The Age, the report on the fact. Nothing at all on the electric meter, nothing on the radio, nothing at all on television. That didn't come to a few days later because basically what they were so shocked. I thought, this is the big story. This is the first Australian to be charged with a war crime. This has to be the leading news the next day. No, it wasn't. Because the government pulled it in and the media fell into line, the ABC included.
Well, it's like our jails, though. There was a murmur of discontent.
Murmur of discontent. Now, Ray, we've got some entertainment coming, so I don't want to keep Mr. Trump waiting. Now, Raymond, I'm a bit disconcerted by you. You said you read it in the Herald Sun. I mean, we could, we're a bit worried here, mate. What's going on?
I go to the library every day. I look through all the papers. I don't buy them. I look through all the papers at the library. I go to the Carrie Bush library.
Yeah. That's what he tells us.
Even in Australia, I even go through that. I go through the lot.
Yes, Doug. Before. Yeah, I haven't mentioned.
At your introduction,
Yeah.
how in Queensland, according to the outback
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
that were recruited, they were told they'd be home for Christmas.
That's right. Yeah.
And also, you haven't mentioned, which I believe is shit, you know, but you haven't mentioned how they were forced to shoot their bloody horses
That's right.
individually
Yeah.
because they they didn't want to spend the money
To bring him
to
back.
send them back.
Yeah, but
As far as I'm concerned,
yeah.
and I was brought up with bloody Anzac,
Yeah.
and you know, and I think it's a day of mourning.
Yeah. It is a day of mourning,
I think it's shit, you know, really.
but it is a day of mourning. You're mourning those that are lost.
It's turned into a bloody celebration.
Yeah. It's initially it was a day of mourning.
We were forced as kids to attend the Anzac thing,
Yeah.
you know, the day prior to
Yeah.
thing. It was drilled into us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the good thing about only having to shoot your horses after World War One was during the Boer War, the Aboriginal horsemen, which we took across to fight in the Boer War, were not allowed to come back to Australia because of the White Australia policy. So about 50 Aboriginal horsemen were left in South Africa after the Boer War. So things did improve.
Just